The night air in Alexandria hung thick with incense and desire. In the royal chambers of the palace, a 21-year-old queen pressed her lips against the neck of Rome's most powerful man, a general 52 years old, married, and standing at the pinnacle of an empire that had conquered the known world. What happened in that room would shake the foundations of Western civilization, trigger wars that would consume thousands of lives, and create a scandal so explosive that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. This is the story of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen who didn't just seduce two of Rome's mightiest warriors. She got pregnant by both of them, bore their children, and in doing so, nearly brought the greatest empire on earth to its knees. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. This wasn't just some ancient romance. This was political warfare waged through the bedroom. This was a woman using her body as a weapon when she had no armies that could match Rome's legions. And the Romans, they were absolutely terrified of her. So terrified that they branded her with a title that would echo through the centuries, the whore of the East. Let me take you back to a world where power was everything, where a woman's womb could determine the fate of nations, and where the line between love and war was written in blood and betrayal. The year is 48 BC, and Egypt is dying. Not the romantic, mysterious Egypt of legend, but a country drowning in debt, weakened by corruption, and about to be swallowed whole by the Roman Empire. The pharaohs, once considered living gods, have been reduced to puppets dancing on Roman strings. The glory days of the pyramids were already ancient history, and the kingdom's power was crumbling like forgotten temple stones. And sitting on that crumbling throne is Cleopatra VII, barely into her 20s, fighting a civil war against her own brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII. Yes, you heard that right. She was married to her brother, a boy barely into his teens. That's how Egyptian royalty rolled back then, keeping the bloodline pure, preserving the Ptolemaic dynasty that stretched back to Alexander the Great's general, even if it meant family dinners were incredibly awkward, and court politics became a lethal game of sibling rivalry. But Cleopatra wasn't like the pharaohs who came before her. She spoke 9 languages fluently: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Median, Parthian, and more. She had studied philosophy with the greatest minds Alexandria could offer, mastered mathematics and astronomy, and learned the art of persuasion from scholars who understood that words could conquer where swords failed. While other rulers relied on their generals and advisors, Cleopatra sharpened her mind into a weapon more dangerous than any sword. She understood something fundamental about power that most people miss even today. The person who controls the narrative controls everything. When she got kicked out of Alexandria by her brother's advisors, powerful men who wanted a puppet king they could control, not a brilliant queen who asked too many questions, she didn't give up. She didn't flee to some distant kingdom and live out her days in comfortable exile. Instead, she did something that would make or break her entire future. She decided to gamble everything on one man, one meeting, one night that would change the course of history. Enter Julius Caesar, the most famous military commander in the world, fresh from defeating his rival Pompey in a brutal civil war that had torn the Roman Republic apart. He arrived in Alexandria chasing his enemy, but what he found there was something far more dangerous than any army. Picture this man, 52 years old, balding, lean from decades of military campaigns, with eyes that had seen more battles than most men could imagine. He had conquered Gaul, killing and enslaving millions, expanding Rome's territory to the Atlantic Ocean. He had crossed the Rubicon with his legions, launching a civil war rather than face prosecution. He had made himself the unofficial king of Rome, even though Romans were supposed to hate kings with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. He was married to Calpurnia back in Rome, a respectable Roman matron who fit the mold of what a proper wife should be. Quiet, modest, invisible. A woman who knew her place was in the home, managing the household while her husband conquered the world. a woman who would never dare to speak in public forums or discuss politics or philosophy. And then Cleopatra appeared. The legend says she had herself smuggled into Caesar's residence rolled up in a carpet, though some sources say it was a linen sack. Either way, imagine the scene. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, surrounded by his battle-hardened guards, reviewing documents in the captured palace, when suddenly a carpet is unrolled at his feet and out steps this young queen, disheveled, dangerous, and desperate. But here's what made that moment truly remarkable. She didn't beg. She didn't throw herself at his feet and plead for mercy or protection. She didn't play the damsel in distress waiting for a strong man to save her. Instead, she talked to him as an equal, speaking to him in perfect Latin, discussing philosophy, power, and the future of the Mediterranean world. She debated military strategy, quoted Greek philosophers, and analyzed the political situation with the precision of a seasoned general. Caesar was hooked, not just by her appearance, though ancient sources tell us she was magnetic, not conventionally beautiful in the way Romans expected, but captivating, with a voice like music and a presence that commanded attention. What truly enslaved him was her mind. Here was a woman who understood power the way he did, who saw the world not as it was but as it could be shaped through will and intelligence. That night, they became lovers. And Caesar, the man who had calculated every military move with cold precision, who never made decisions based on emotion, made a choice that defied all logic. He would put Cleopatra back on the throne, even if it meant going to war against her brother's forces in a country that wasn't even his to rule. The Alexandrian War was short but brutal. Caesar's battle-hardened Roman legions crushed the Egyptian forces, who were no match for soldiers who had conquered Europe. The fighting was street to street, brutal and unforgiving. Alexandria burned in places. The famous library may have lost thousands of scrolls when warehouses near the docks caught fire during the fighting. And Cleopatra's brother husband, he drowned in the Nile, weighed down by his golden armor as he tried to flee the battlefield. Some say it was an accident. Some say Cleopatra made sure he would never challenge her again. Either way, Cleopatra became the undisputed ruler of Egypt. And Caesar, he stayed, and stayed, and stayed. For 9 months, the dictator of Rome lingered in Alexandria like a lovesick teenager, cruising down the Nile with Cleopatra on her royal barge. They floated past ancient temples and villages, surrounded by luxury that would make Roman senators weep with envy. They attended lavish feasts where wine flowed like water and entertainers performed spectacles that hadn't been seen since the days of the great pharaohs. Caesar, the man who famously said, "Veni, vidi, vici," I came, I saw, I conquered, because he moved so fast that battles were over before anyone realized they'd started, was now moving like honey in winter. Back in Rome, people were whispering, what could possibly keep Julius Caesar, the man who moved faster than his own messengers, trapped in Egypt for so long? What kind of spell had this foreign queen cast over their great general? The answer came in 47 BC when Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion Little Caesar. The message was clear, announced to the world without apology. This child was Caesar's son, the heir to both Egypt and potentially Rome itself. Now, let's pause here and understand why this was nuclear-level scandal in the Roman world. Rome was a republic, at least in name. They had thrown out their kings 500 years earlier, in 509 BC, when the tyrannical Tarquin the Proud had been expelled from the city. They built their entire identity around the idea that no one man should have ultimate power. They created a complex system of checks and balances, with 2 consuls elected annually, a senate to advise and control them, and tribunes to protect the common people. Caesar was already pushing those boundaries, making himself dictator for life, putting his face on coins like he was some kind of monarch, accepting honors that looked suspiciously like worship. The Senate was filled with men who muttered about his ambitions, who remembered that Rome was supposed to be a free republic, but having a legitimate son, an heir, That crossed a line that Rome wasn't ready to accept, especially when that son was born to a foreign queen, in a foreign land, steeped in Eastern customs and Egyptian religion, outside of Roman marriage laws. A son who could claim to be the heir to both the kingdom of Egypt and the mastery of Rome. A son who represented everything Rome feared about monarchy and dynastic succession. And Caesar was married to Calpurnia, who was waiting for him back in Rome, humiliated beyond measure, knowing that the entire city was gossiping about her husband's Egyptian mistress and their bastard child. Every Roman matron whispered about it in the markets. Every senator smirked about it in the forum. But Cleopatra wasn't done. In one of history's boldest power moves, she actually came to Rome in 46 BC. Caesar set her up in his villa across the Tiber River, in the gardens that he had built for his own pleasure. And there, she held court like a visiting monarch, receiving Roman nobles, displaying her wealth with Egyptian gold and precious stones, and most provocatively, bringing little Caesarion with her. She was daring Rome to recognize her son as Caesar's heir, flaunting their affair in front of the entire city. She didn't hide in shame or pretend their relationship was anything other than what it was. She acted like a queen in her own right, negotiating treaties, discussing philosophy with Roman intellectuals, making it clear that she considered herself Caesar's equal, not his conquest. The Romans were disgusted, not just because of the adultery, though that was bad enough in a culture that prized traditional family values and female modesty. It was the foreignness of it all. Cleopatra represented everything Rome feared. Eastern luxury that would corrupt simple Roman virtue, monarchical power that would destroy republican freedom. A woman wielding authority like a man in a world where women were supposed to be silent and submissive. They saw her as a corrupting influence, a witch who had enslaved their greatest general with exotic sexuality and Egyptian magic. Stories spread through Rome like plague. She bathed in milk and honey. She wore makeup made from crushed beetles and lead. She performed strange Egyptian rituals. She had unnatural power over men. The Senate seethed, but they couldn't move against her directly, not while Caesar lived. And Caesar, for his part, seemed to be planning something that would have shattered Roman tradition forever. There were rumors he wanted to move the capital to Alexandria. There was talk he was going to marry Cleopatra officially, despite the fact that marriage to foreigners was illegal for Roman citizens. Some whispered that he would make Caesarion his legal heir, bypassing all the carefully constructed Roman laws about adoption and succession. He even had a golden statue of Cleopatra placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom the Julian family claimed descent. A foreign queen, honored like a goddess in a Roman temple. It was blasphemy to traditional Romans. And then on the Ides of March 44 BC, everything changed. 23 knife wounds ended Julius Caesar's life on the floor of the Senate. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, thought they were saving the Republic from tyranny. They thought they were heroes. What they actually did was plunge Rome into another devastating civil war and leave Cleopatra alone, vulnerable, and desperate in a city that hated her. She fled back to Egypt with Caesarion as soon as it was safe to travel, and for 3 years, she watched from Alexandria as Rome tore itself apart. Mark Antony was everything Caesar wasn't. Where Caesar was calculating and controlled, Antony was passionate and impulsive. He was younger, more physical, a soldier's soldier who could drink his men under the table and still lead cavalry charges at dawn with reckless courage. He was handsome in the way Caesar never was, with the muscular build of a warrior and the charm of a natural leader. Men loved serving under him because he treated them like comrades, not pawns. He was also one of Caesar's closest allies, his right-hand man in the civil wars. And after the dust settled from the chaos following Caesar's assassination, after the conspirators were defeated at Philippi, Antony found himself ruling the eastern half of the Roman Empire while Octavian, Caesar's legal heir, controlled the west. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey. He needed money to fund his military campaigns against the Parthians, Rome's greatest enemy in the east. And Egypt was the richest kingdom in the region, with grain harvests that could feed armies and gold that could pay for endless wars. Cleopatra knew this was her chance to secure Egypt's future, to find another Roman protector now that Caesar was gone. But she also knew she needed to make an impression that would burn itself into Antony's memory forever. She arrived in a ship that looked like something out of a fever dream. The sails were purple, the color of royalty, dyed with rare Tyrian purple that cost more than gold. The oars were silver, flashing in the Mediterranean sun. The deck was strewn with flowers and precious fabrics, and she herself was dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, reclining under a golden canopy while beautiful young men dressed as Cupid fanned her with peacock feathers. Musicians played hypnotic melodies. Incense burned in golden braziers. It was theater, propaganda, and seduction all rolled into one spectacular entrance. The entire city of Tarsus came out to watch. Antony, who was holding court in the city forum, found himself sitting alone because everyone had gone to see the Egyptian queen's arrival. Antony was overwhelmed. This wasn't just attraction. This was obsession from the first moment. Where Caesar had been charmed by Cleopatra's intelligence and seduced by her political acumen, Antony fell for the complete package. Her wit, her wealth, her exotic appeal, her ability to party like a Macedonian queen. She could match him drink for drink, laugh at his jokes, discuss military strategy, and transition seamlessly into philosophical debates. They spent the winter together in Alexandria, throwing legendary feasts that became famous throughout the ancient world. They formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure and luxury beyond imagination. They would disguise themselves and roam the streets at night, playing pranks on ordinary Alexandrians. They hunted, they feasted, they made love, living like gods while the world outside prepared for war. And then Antony left. He went back to Italy in 40 BC, where political necessity called. He married Octavia, the sister of his rival Octavian, in a political marriage designed to keep the peace between them and prevent another civil war. He left Cleopatra pregnant with twins. Imagine that moment. Cleopatra, who had just secured what she thought was a powerful alliance, who had given herself to another Roman general and bound him with the same weapons of intimacy that had worked with Caesar, suddenly abandoned while carrying his children. For 3 years, Antony stayed away. 3 years during which Cleopatra gave birth to Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, twins whose very names declared their parents' ambition. Helios means sun, Selene means moon. They weren't just children. They were cosmic symbols of a new world order. In 37 BC, Antony came back to the east. And this time, he never really left. Whatever political calculation had taken him away before was gone, burned away by whatever hold Cleopatra had over him. He abandoned his campaign in Italy, neglected his Roman wife Octavia, and threw himself completely into Cleopatra's world with a totality that shocked even his closest allies. They had another child together in 36 BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus, cementing their bond. But more importantly, Antony began acting like an Egyptian king rather than a Roman general. He wore Egyptian dress at official ceremonies. He gave away Roman territories to Cleopatra and their children in what became known as the Donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, a ceremony where he literally carved up the eastern provinces and handed them out like party favors. Most explosively, he declared Caesarion the true son of Julius Caesar and legitimate king of kings. Back in Rome, Octavian saw his opportunity. He launched a propaganda campaign that was brutal in its effectiveness. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign witch who had enslaved Antony with drugs and sexuality. He called her the whore of the East, a title that stuck because it played into every Roman prejudice about foreign women and Eastern corruption. He claimed she wanted to destroy Rome, to rule from Alexandria, to make proud Roman citizens bow to an Egyptian queen. And the worst part, some of it was probably true. Cleopatra did want to reshape the Mediterranean world with Alexandria at its center. She did want her children to inherit kingdoms that would rival Rome. She had turned two of Rome's greatest men into her weapons, using pregnancy and promises of dynasty to bind them to her cause. The Romans were terrified because Cleopatra represented something they couldn't defeat with legions. The idea that their way of life, their values, their entire civilization could be seduced and corrupted by a single woman with enough ambition and intelligence. The final confrontation came at Actium in 31 BC, off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces faced Octavian's fleet in a naval battle that would determine the fate of the Roman world. It should have been close. Antony was a proven military commander. They had ships, soldiers, and resources, but something went wrong. In the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly turned and fled. Antony, seeing her ships leaving, made a decision that destroyed everything. He abandoned his own forces and followed her. Whether it was panic, a prearranged signal misunderstood, or simply the action of a man so in love he couldn't bear separation, we'll never know. What we do know is that it destroyed them both. They fled back to Alexandria, knowing Octavian would follow. For nearly a year, they lived in a strange twilight, throwing parties and preparing for death. They formed a suicide club called the Order of the Inseparable in Death, acknowledging their story could only end one way. When Octavian's forces finally breached Alexandria's walls in 30 BC, Antony fell on his sword. But he botched it and lay bleeding when word came that Cleopatra still lived. His men carried him to her, and he died in her arms while she wept. And Cleopatra, facing capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in chains, chose her own end. The asp, the sacred cobra of Egypt, became her final escape. She dressed in her royal regalia and allowed the serpent to bite her. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 22 years, borne 4 children to 2 different Roman leaders, and nearly changed the course of Western civilization. Octavian, who would become Caesar Augustus, understood the power of narrative. He had Caesarion hunted down and killed. "Too many Caesars," he supposedly said. The other children he brought back to Rome, where they were raised by Antony's widow Octavia. Cleopatra Selene eventually married a Berber king and became queen in her own right, the only one of Cleopatra's children to thrive. But Cleopatra herself, Octavian turned her into a monster in Roman propaganda. For centuries, she was remembered not as a skilled ruler who kept Egypt independent for 2 decades while surrounded by Roman power, not as a polyglot scholar and strategic genius, but as a seductress, a witch, a foreign whore who corrupted noble Roman men. And here's the thing that makes this story resonate even today. Cleopatra used the only weapons available to her in a world where women weren't supposed to have power. She weaponized sexuality, pregnancy, and motherhood because she understood that in a man's world, those were the cards she could play. She gambled that having children with Rome's most powerful men would protect Egypt, would give her sons kingdoms, would let her reshape the world. She almost won. If Actium had gone differently, if Antony had held his nerve, if the political winds had shifted just slightly, we might be living in a world where Alexandria remained the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, where Cleopatra's children founded dynasties, where the fusion of Egyptian and Roman power created something entirely new. Instead, Rome won, and the winners wrote the history. They called her a scandal, a whore, a cautionary tale about foreign corruption. They made sure everyone remembered her as a woman who got pregnant by powerful men and used her children as pawns. But 2,000 years later, everyone remembers Cleopatra. Most people can't name Octavian's wife. Calpurnia is a footnote. But Cleopatra, she became legend, which is perhaps the ultimate victory. She scared Rome so badly that they had to destroy her reputation to feel safe. And even that wasn't enough. She's still here, in every story, every film, every retelling, reminding us that power takes many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword. It's a woman who refuses to accept the limitations her world tries to place on her. That's the real scandal of Cleopatra. Not that she got pregnant, not that she had affairs. The scandal was that she played the game better than the men who wrote the rules, and they never forgave her for it. The whore of the East became the queen of legend, and that transformation is the final victory in a game that outlasted empires.